If you listen, you can hear the water moving, steady, ancient, patient. In Arkansas, our rivers are more than scenery, they're storytellers. They've carried dreamers and explorers, built towns, erased them, and given rise to legends that still ripple beneath the surface. In this episode, we're tracing those currents, from Jefferson's forgotten expedition to the fight to save the Buffalo River, to the ghost towns and myths that still haunt the water's edge. This is Rivers of Memory, and you're watching Whispers in the Holler. Celebrity historian Rafi Andonian, thanks so much for joining me to talk about rivers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah. So what is it about rivers that makes them such powerful keepers of memory?
Think about how rivers have a lot of life surrounding them, quite literally for centuries, giving life with the floodplains for agriculture, right? And being used for transportation to literally take you from town to town, from civilization to civilization. Here in Arkansas, for example, you have 90,000 miles of river, 30 plus rivers that are in the state, including, of course, Arkansas River that goes across the entire state.
Right.
And more than half of the rivers help mark borders and boundaries for the state. So I think that it helps shape identity for a place because you literally refer to it on a map. And the memory that shapes around that is around based on who you are as peoples and where they lead to in transportation. Many rivers of the past were named after the peoples and civilizations and towns that they led to. And so I think that when you're coming around rivers for trade, for transportation, for agriculture, quite literally giving life, and the stories of the people around them, that makes it something that really captures a sense of place and the memory of the generations that have done many things to gather in those spaces.
I also think rivers just kind of connect to our soul. It's perhaps the reason why people like to go to the beach and sit there in the sand and you hear the waves rushing in. But some of us who didn't grow up on the beach would just as soon go on the banks and listen to that water rushing over rocks or falling off a mountain. I think that they kind of refresh our spirit.
Okay, Sabrina, what first drew you to the story of Hunter and Dunbar? What about that expedition called you as a dramatist?
Oh gosh, it is a story. I love it because it has wild dramatic arcs. It's an adventure story, and then ultimately, like, nothing major happens, which I kind of like, because it's not what you expect, right? You expect this narrative arc of they start out this journey, there are obstacles, they overcome the obstacles, they reach this like place of enlightenment or this place of change, and then we have, they go home on a boat.
Yeah.
But with this one, I don't know that we have that moment. And I like that because that's honest, right? That's a part of life. Is sometimes we start out on these journeys and we have the highest hopes, we have the biggest plans, and we encounter huge obstacles, and the only thing changes is ourselves. And I also like, I like the cultural complexity of it. I like that the crew was constructed of people from all kinds of backgrounds, and that they had to kind of navigate that and learn how to work together.
Towns, I do feel like have a spirit or don't have a spirit, and a place like Rush has a spirit. You can feel that when you're walking around, and I think some of it helps when you do see those signs and those old pictures and you're piecing together, the paths people had to walk every day to get to work, or where they might have lived and just the wildlife that was in that area, that, you know, and then there's towns that you visit that don't have that feeling. They just kind of, you know, there's a couple of buildings that are out here and there's really not much of a story to it, or you don't know much about the story. But I think piecing the story together with actually going and seeing the places is really what gives a spirit when I'm walking around.
Yeah. Coming up.
I really am more drawn to stories like Hunter-Dunbar than I would be Lewis and Clark. We all know Lewis and Clark, but who the heck has heard of Hunter-Dunbar? Both teams were commissioned by Thomas Jefferson. For a very short period. Hunter-Dunbar were more famous because they came back first.
And later.
So when I came in, the first thing I saw were these abandoned houses and old buildings on what you would maybe consider a main street. And they just looked very authentic. And I've gone to a lot of ghost towns. You go to places maybe that are more touristy, and then you go to a place like Rush and you go, you know, this is authentic feeling already.
Long before Lewis and Clark charted their northern route, Thomas Jefferson sent 2 men south to Louisiana and up through Arkansas to discover the edge of a new America. Their journey would uncover both mystery and memory, a story almost lost to time.
I really am more drawn to stories like Hunter-Dunbar than I would be Lewis and Clark. We all know Lewis and Clark, but who the heck has heard of Hunter-Dunbar? And when you dig into the story, they were both teams were commissioned by Thomas Jefferson. For a very short period. Hunter-Dunbar were more famous because they came back first.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So I thought, you know, we'll call that the Forgotten Expedition. So I was attracted to the story, and of the films that I have worked on, and I worked on this one with my longtime collaborator, Dale Carpenter, I think it may be one of the most underrated films I've done.
Because it is a journey and you have a starting point and an end point, it seems like there's already dramatic structure in place and the obstacles that they have to overcome, even if the resolution doesn't quite come to what you want it to be. When did you begin to see that sort of dramatic structure in the story with those rising stakes and the conflict and all those emotional arcs for these real humans?
You know, I think those things exist before the story even begins, which is what I like about it. And I think it's a incredibly American story. My son is learning about the Declaration of Independence, the formation of this country, and his teacher is having him contrast the ideas of Thomas Jefferson with Alexander Hamilton. And I think in those two characters, Dunbar and Hunter, we have the similar dynamic because their backgrounds are so different. Dunbar was an aristocrat. Hunter was a poor guy who kind of learned about chemistry, made his way up in the world. So you have two very different people, but with a similar background, right? They're both from Scotland. They both come to this country. They both make their way. So you have opposites working in the same direction, which I think is already a conflict, right? And so that as a starting place was really interesting to me.
Jefferson first commissioned a grand expedition up the Arkansas River to its source. Then came a warning about Osage danger and a presidential pause. So Hunter and Dunbar proposed a scaled mission, Hot Springs, by way of the Black and Washita rivers.
George Hunter and William Dunbar wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson and pleaded with him to let us go to Hot Springs. We've heard about it, a great natural place to explore and to see what's there. Could it really be the fountain of youth?
Right.
And so Jefferson said, okay, go on.
So you said Hunter wrote everything down, right? Journals, and you dug into that. Did anything from your research surprise you?
One of the things that surprised me from reading Hunter's journal is that this wasn't just a great wasteland. People were living out here. People were living in northern Louisiana, what we now know as, in southern Arkansas, and they would run upon people, and they would run upon an American Indian, a member of the Delaware tribe.
Sure.
And you know, they saw things and they wrote about things, and when they got to hot springs, they talked about hot springs the way we kind of know hot springs without all the buildings.
Right.
So it was just all kind of fascinating to see what was going on in that early American time period.
Yeah.
Fascinating. First-person account.
So what do you think about this forgotten expedition reveals about Thomas Jefferson's idea of America?
Thomas Jefferson is one of the most complex individuals that's ever walked the United States.
Yeah.
Good and bad. But he was all about learning for learning's sake. And I think as much as anything, he just wanted to personally know what is out there in this big expanse of land, you know, that we purchased.
So I can remember when we were sort of putting this play together that there were so many memorable moments from their journey. And I'm just curious for you, in your playwriting and in thinking this through, was there a particular scene or a moment in that journey that you thought, oh, I want to see this played out on stage?
Yeah, and I had, you know, two come to mind, and I will say the first one just based on a visual that pops into my head. Hunter, and I think this was part of it. Of course, he was a brilliant chemist and naturalist and just a genius. But for the sake of comedic value in the play, and as a contrast to Dunbar, we portray him as a little bit of a bumbling guy.
Yeah.
You know, he makes mistakes, things go wrong. He constructs this giant Chinese boat that can't make it down the river. That's like his first thing. He gets sick. I think he calls it an attack of the gravel, which is a weird phrase. But he also shoots himself in the face.
That's a memorable moment right there, right? And he and he carried on after that?
He did. It's so funny. He was going down the river in his boat, cleaning his gun. They, you know, hit rapids, and I'm not an expert in old school guns, but there probably wasn't a safety on, so it went off in his face. And the visual of it for me is so strong because luckily did not kill him, but it burned off his eyebrows. They also get stuck in the river for something awful like 36 hours. And they are, you know, doing their best to get the boat moving. They're caught in this waterfall. They can't get out of it. And sustained drama is potentially hilarious to me because the stakes are really high. And it's also technically boring because it's going on and on and on and on.
If she revisited the play today, Sabrina says she'd tell it through new eyes, through the memory of Hunter's 15-year-old son, looking back on the journey.
That does tap into the element of mystery, of memory, right?
Yeah.
How do we remember things? How are our memories different based on how old we were and our relationships with those people? So I think it would be from his point of view. And then I would maybe really like to examine some of the cultural relationships, conflicts, portrayals, just to make sure that that story is properly told.
Sure.
And in a thoughtful way.
Focusing on Arkansas rivers, they came up from Louisiana, maybe up through, there was like the Washita River in there, and I feel like learning about rivers is such an important prospect for young learners as well. So I don't know, I'm just curious about how the rivers would have made their way into the story, and would they have been a side character? I mean, obviously they're on a river most of this journey, so fill us in on that.
It's really interesting. I don't know that they could have even been an entire puppeteer. You know, they recently did a version of Life of Pi on Broadway.
Yes, it was beautiful. It was I saw it on Broadway, and I was stunned at how they used the puppetry in that.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that kind of work with this piece, you know. So there's a puppeteer who is a tiger, and there's a fight between a man and this giant puppet tiger. I think the water and the boat are obviously characters in that story as well. And
Yes.
I think, yeah, it's both the force that's moving you forward and the force that's trapping you in a waterfall. It is your obstacle, and it is your only way of getting where you need to go.
It's your obstacle and it's your salvation. Coming up. Why do you think this particular creature sort of has endured and fascinated people for such a long time?
We love water monsters, you know, and I think we're scared of the water in a bigger way, and it's more mysterious in a lot of ways than space. So it's going to house our strangest creatures, and I think those are inherently exciting. But it's also just the furthest escalation of the big fish story.
And later.
They have these signs, they have some pictures, and you can see what they were in their heyday, and then you're standing there where it happened, and it's like piecing those things together. And so that's when it feels like alive in a way. And so there were several of those. You're like, well, this old building is a blacksmith shop, and then here is the actual photo of it when it was operating.
Centuries later, another Arkansas river would make headlines. Not for history, but for preservation. The Buffalo became the first national river, proving that sometimes the best way to move forward is to keep a river wild. After years of assignments, filmmaker Larry Foley chose a story of his own. The Buffalo Flows, America's first national river.
The Buffalo River begins and ends in a wilderness. She is born in the Ozark Mountains, springing from the hills and into rock-framed valleys carved by weather and ageless time. It is a river of firsts, with a picturesque landscape like no other, meandering 148 miles through canyons and forest until she empties into another river known as the White. Along the way is beauty that folks fought to preserve. Save the buffalo was the cry. Don't let her be drowned by her own waters. They won that battle and federal protection. And today there is a future that mirrors the past because the buffalo flows.
It was a passion project, but I learned that, I'm telling the story, but everybody that watches it connects to their story and their relationship to the river.
Yeah.
So it had this emotional attachment to people that I hadn't even considered when I was just out there making a film.
Yeah, it's a byproduct of a great film. And you kind of have already mentioned this, but I'm curious about maybe both films are focused on rivers, right? And rivers seem to carry memory, they seem to carry history. Why do you think waterways resonate with viewers so much?
Well, historically the waterways of America were the highways. It's how we got places. If you were going to farm, you needed to have a source of water. But I also think rivers just kind of connect to our soul. It's perhaps the reason why people like to go to the beach and sit there in the sand and you hear the waves rushing in. But some of us who didn't grow up on the beach would just as soon go on the banks and listen to that water rushing over rocks or falling off a mountain. I think that they kind of refresh our spirit. When I produced that film, I knew that the battle for the buffalo would be an important story. But I didn't want it just to be another rehash of the battle for the Buffalo River, to save it from being dammed. A lot of people don't know that there were actually 2 dams planned on the Buffalo. One at Gilbert and another down at Buffalo Point. That was a part of the story, but it wasn't the whole story. And so what I really wanted to do was tell stories along the way.
Yeah.
And to talk about what we saved, what we preserved, what we didn't bury up
Yeah.
under an impoundment of water.
Yeah.
And I wanted to showcase the culture.
The park was built on this high point because there were plans for a dam that would have turned the river and the valley below into a huge lake. But as time went by and generations of vacationers came to this and other sites along the Buffalo, a groundswell of protest rose up to keep the river the way it had always been. Buffalo State Park, along with Ponca on the upper river, would serve as rally points for what would become known as the Battle for the Buffalo.
When people go to a place year after year and they have all those memories and old photographs and of all the fun they had and all the things they did, and somebody talks about doing something really drastic to that place, like covering it up with water, people get emotionally involved in that. It's not one of those logical arguments.
And you travel around all over the nation, and I know you have a specific focus here. You come to Northwest Arkansas quite a lot. In your travels around, how have you seen rivers shape identity?
What I would say with the rivers that shapes identity is you find a couple of different categories of that. One is on an agricultural site, because a lot of times you see, for example, the Mississippi River floodplain, right? That was something that was very much used to help agriculture. Another thing that you find that when I'm going around is the river towns, whether they're for gambling, right? Sometimes for riverboat gambling and going up and down the Mississippi, for example, or serving tourism and such. And so the river very much, being a river city, means something and very much shapes the sense of a place, and that's what I witness myself. When I look at it as international transportation hubs, because the rivers here in Arkansas, many of them, of course, go into the Mississippi, which goes down to Memphis and New Orleans and goes out to the entire world. So when I experience a river, a lot of times what I do is just stand there and look at the boats and listen for the boat's sound. And that, to me, helps shape the experience of the river, because you're experiencing it like people have for centuries. Really global trade, a global connection. It's a highway. Rivers are the highways of history, meaning that they connect the world. And that's how I think of it myself when I experience different river cities. That's a unifying thing that I find.
Do you think that rivers hold on to emotion, sort of the echoes of things that have happened along those river banks?
In some ways they do, because of the fact that you think about rivers are still places we gather, even if you're not trading, for recreation.
Yeah.
So when you go there for recreation, you can go obviously hiking and fishing and canoeing and all kinds of stuff, picnicking. You don't have to go in the water necessarily. Actually, a great example of that here is Buffalo National River. Believe it or not, that was the first national river in the National Park Service system right here in Arkansas. And so, I think that draw that it still has, even if I'm not someone that's trading on the river or growing crops with the spillage water of the river, that draw of joy that it brings for recreation is something deeper, I think. Humans have long been drawn to water, not only for survival, but there's something about sitting and looking at the water that we find peaceful. I don't know enough biology to say how deep that goes, but there is that connection there. And I think historically speaking, that connection to enjoying the water, not just working in it or playing in it, it does have, the river does have some sort of connection to humans.
Yeah.
One of my favorite scenes in that film, and I'll tell you the story because it's kind of a fun story.
Yeah.
I'd gone over on my sabbatical and made connection with Pastor Claude at Boxley Valley Baptist Church, and I asked him, I said, "Do you baptize people in the river?" And I'm thinking that would really be cool if they did. And he said, "Well, if we have people to baptize, we do." And so we had the scene all set up. And he called me up and said, "Larry, I hate to tell you this, but we're not going to be able to baptize anybody on Sunday." And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" Yeah. And he said, "Well, we've got this group of folks who've been camping up. I think they were called the Rainbow People. They'd been camping out at the northern end of the river, and State Pollution Control and Ecology Commission came out and did a fecal count, and it was too high, and nobody wanted to get in the river." Okay. And so we waited, and the river water had gone down. I mean, it was sometime, and it was in September by now. And we filmed at the same time. We filmed the homecoming at the church, and then after that, the baptism. 2 churches, and neither one knew this was going to happen, descended upon the river at the same time to
Wow.
baptize folks.
Yeah.
And I ran into a former student of mine who had married a local guy and was living on the Buffalo and raising kids, and in her words, fixing to be baptized. And so she and her husband were baptized in the river the day we filmed, and then we went back and kind of talked about why they lived on the river and what the river meant to them.
Well, they say that the Buffalo River is the cleanest river in the nation, and to be baptized is, in some senses, to be purified and reborn.
I baptized you, my sister, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, bearing the likeness of his death, raised in the likeness of his resurrection. Amen.
Everybody lined up on the bridge and sang, and all of our, friends and family were there. I was with Joe, my husband, and we shared the same religion and did it on the same day.
It's holy water.
Yeah.
I think the teaching point is no matter how much research you do and how much you plan these things out, you better have your eyes and ears open to opportunities of stories that you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, and there it is. Coming up.
Yeah, I've probably documented thousands of little towns, and I get asked a lot, what's your favorite place you've ever been? So when I get asked so many times, I actually made a video of my favorite places, and Rush was in that video. Now, it wasn't number 1, but close, and if out of 1,000, it's probably in the top 10 or 15, and it's just a very memorable place and highly recommended for people to visit.
Of course, not every river story ends in celebration. Some are whispered in ruins, ghost towns, and legends that refuse to fade. Proof that water can both give life and take it back. For over a century, Arkansas's Buffalo River has carried stories of the people who built their lives along its banks. And in some places, those stories are still standing. One of them is Rush, a ghost town tucked deep in the Ozark Hills. To learn more, I spoke with traveler and documentarian John Wise, who explored the site for his YouTube channel, Travel with a Wise Guy. Several years ago, you went to Rush, Arkansas. What drew you to Rush?
So I was planning a trip to go to Arkansas to film a variety of videos. One was the 10 smallest towns of Arkansas, which turned out to be really interesting. But I like visiting ghost towns, and a lot of those smallest towns are also kind of ghost towns too. And Rush would always pop up when I'd search for, ghost towns and places like that. So I'm like, well, I'm gonna go. And I didn't do any research on it. I just wanted to kind of go in blind and see what it was. Sometimes there's things there and sometimes there isn't. So initially to visit Rush, it was just because I was visiting other places, and it was one of the places along the way.
What stood out to you the moment you arrived? Anything like spring to mind?
So when I came in, the first thing I saw were these abandoned houses and old buildings on what you would maybe consider a main street. And they just looked very authentic. And I've gone to a lot of ghost towns, and you go to places maybe that are more touristy, and then you go to a place like Rush and you go, this is authentic feeling already.
He followed the road from Rush Landing back through the ruins, piecing together photos on the markers with the structures that still stand today. It was, as he put it, history alive. And let's say you have a river who has a city or a town that's associated with it that is there solely because it is on the river. Might be a little bit more difficult to get to, though, for transportation.
That's right.
So then that town might become a ghost town.
That's right.
Because it dries up and the rest of the world moves in a different direction. Have you encountered any towns like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here in Arkansas, you have Rush, the city of Rush. That's a ghost town. And indeed, that was hard to get to because the water was not deep enough for being there on the river. And so as a result, they had to get mules to pull stuff out to a further river that it was deep enough, or to go to the railroad and connect to the railroad, right? So, and the railroad, more broadly speaking, separate of the incident of Rush, was something that eventually replaced the rivers as a network. We still use rivers today, of course, but it really competed with it and replaced a lot of the river traffic. But yes, that does happen, and as a result of that difficulty, you may often have, you know, a ghost town situation. But also what I would look at is what made that town boom. What were they trading on the river or the railroad or wherever the case may be? In the case of Rush, you have zinc. That's what they were doing over there, mining, and you know, that's what made them rich. Rush was at one point the most prosperous town in Arkansas. And eventually, when zinc's prices went down after World War I, what happened is that really made it suffer as a result of that. And so that also is going to affect things, because think about it. When the price of a good goes down, it needs to be cheap to be able to make it to remain profitable. Where if you're having a hard time getting connected to the global trade we just talked about, then that's not cheap to do anymore. And so as a result, you need to command high prices to make it worth pursuing. We see that in oil too, by the way. When oil prices go very high, another commodity, when oil prices go very high, what happens is companies get more adventurous in going to hard to seek places for oil because there's a more likelihood of return. But when oil prices are down, there's less willingness to go to remote places, and they go to tried and true places to have a cheaper production. The same thing applies to zinc. Now, Rush was so popular and so renowned for its zinc that in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, they had zinc on display and won awards at both of those World's Fairs. That's how much attention was on Rush, Arkansas for the zinc production.
Wow, that's fascinating to me. And also kind of to that extent, right? So you have this town and it dries up for whatever reason. So you've got this ghost town. It's on a river. Why do you think humans' fascination with sort of the mystery, maybe the ghosts, surround rivers, not just here in Arkansas, but kind of throughout the country?
Because around rivers, not only do you have all the memory that we talked about with people gathering, whether it's for trade and whether it's for agriculture, food, quite literally sustenance, whether it's for transportation and highways, but also river towns are going to have so much of the part of their identity of having the part of their town often eroded. So Pine Bluff, for example, in Arkansas, had a portion of the town eroded. You go to Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the North American mainland, that a lot of it has eroded. And so there's a certain romance to the city being lost. Of course, there are also floods that can take place, great floods that can take place. Of course, we know many down on the Gulf Coast. And I think that resiliency that comes from rebuilding and or losing a portion of the town, whether it's as a ghost town or it's the erosion that we're talking about, I think that kind of gives it this sense of what used to be here that's no longer possible here, and that gives the outlook that helps lead to the allure of the ghost stories that we talk about.
Okay, so you've been to these places all over the country. What makes a ghost town feel like haunted as opposed to just kind of feeling empty?
So I'm not huge into like the paranormal type haunted stuff, but towns I do feel like have a spirit or don't have a spirit, and a place like Rush has a spirit. You can feel that when you're walking around, and I think some of it helps when you do see those signs and those old pictures, and you're piecing together, you know, the paths people had to walk every day to get to work, or where they might have lived, and just the wildlife that was in that area, that you know, and. Then there's towns that you visit that don't have that feeling. They just kind of, you know, there's a couple of buildings that are out here and there's really not much of a story to it, or you don't know much about the story. But I think piecing the story together with actually going and seeing the places is really what gives a spirit when I'm walking around.
Yeah. As we explored the folklore tied to Arkansas's rivers, one story kept surfacing: the legend of the White River Monster. I spoke with graphic novelist Gustav Carlson, whose art reimagines this mysterious creature that's been described, debated, and occasionally hunted for nearly a century. how do you choose which version to portray in your art?
Well, the White River Monster is one of those monsters that's kind of a gift to an illustrator because there's a lot of free range, because so many of the descriptions of it are pretty contradictory, right? Yeah. So I kind of actually take a basis on some of the actual animals that people presume it could have been. Like the elephant seal.
Yes, I've seen where it has, some descriptions say it has an elephant-like trunk, right?
And there's stories of it where people thought it was either an elephant seal or even an escaped elephant. So I do kind of put a more mammalian kind of thrust to it. And I feel more comfortable with that one because it's one that people have always used largely as kind of a huckster sort of storytelling device. Because it's like a little bit like other monsters where there would be, you know, you pay a quarter to see it, and then they reveal it's just escaped kind of thing. Similar to the Gaurau in that regard. Yeah. So I feel a little bit more freedom in jamming monster and animal parts together on it than I might on a more described creature.
Why do you think this particular creature sort of has endured and fascinated people for such a long time?
We love water monsters, you know, and I think we're scared of the water in a bigger way. And it's more mysterious in a lot of ways than space. So it's going to house our strangest creatures. And I think those are inherently exciting. But it's also just the furthest escalation of the big fish story.
So, if the White River Monster were to show up today, how do you think modern audiences would respond to it compared to audiences of the past?
Well, we're not allowed to hunt it now, so it's definitely safe.
Yeah.
But no, I think, you know, I think with a lot of these, I think we'd be more fond of them than scared.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think an element maybe of our awe or even being frightened by the unknown has gone away over, I don't know, centuries, over decades? Have we lost that a little bit?
I feel like our fear becomes more and more man-shaped. I know I've talked about Bigfoot becoming the ultimate fear, but like, I think that might be that we're making all of our monsters kind of human-shaped. So the fears are getting more internalized. So the animals and the mystery of the world become more exciting than scary.
For Gustav Carlson, the White River Monster isn't just a legend. It's a reflection of who we are and what we fear. In Arkansas, even the monsters in our rivers have stories to tell.
So you've traveled all around, you've been to ghost towns and other maybe lesser known gems all throughout the States. How does this kind of compare to maybe other ghost towns that you have seen?
Yeah, I've probably documented thousands of little towns, and I get asked a lot, what's your favorite place you've ever been? So when I get asked so many times, I actually made a video of my favorite places, and Rush was in that video. Now, it wasn't number one, but it's close, and if out of 1,000, it's probably in the top 10 or 15, and it's just a very memorable place and highly recommended for people to visit.
What would you hope if people go out and check out Rush that they take away from that historical moment that they're able to kind of draw back the curtain and take a peek into?
I think whenever I go to those places, I think that, one, this is so unique to experience this because it might not be here forever. So go and see it while we can. And luckily, Rush is doing a good job of preserving it. But you can look at some of those buildings and be like, man, these might fall down at any moment. So I get that thought, but also the other thought is there's so many more places like Rush, or there aren't mining towns necessarily, but have a history, and they're all across Northwest Arkansas, from Kansas, where I live, all across the country. And the best weekend I have is waking up on a Sunday morning, getting a coffee, driving out to a place I've never been before, and just learning about that history. It's so fascinating. And to know there's many places like that all around the area that you guys are documenting on shows like this that are maybe a non-traditional day trip, but maybe becomes more traditional as people are learning about it.
I like that, yeah.
For travelers like John Wise, Rush isn't just a ghost town. It's proof that memory can live long after the noise fades. The buffalo still runs beside it, and the past still whispers through the trees.
Our rivers remember every story, every sound, every soul that's passed along their banks.
I'm a fan of experiencing history, not just reading about it. Reading is important, but you got to experience it. So the way I think that you continue to keep it through future generations is you actually physically go to the places and enjoy them. But I think that often what helps is to tell the stories of why and how these towns and developments, or even this river is particularly here. Because remember, rivers do change course, and sometimes the river becomes a lake. And maybe the shoreline has changed from the erosion that we've discussed. So the landscape that you're in changes. Historians call that environmental history. And as that environment changes, so too do the settlements and the civilizations and how people interact with that environment change. And so the way I would break that down for people in the future to be able to do that is first to experience it, and then understand how they're experiencing it has both continuities to the past as well as differences from the past. Some differences would be the recreational activity we're talking about, and the continuity, depending on exactly what river you're observing, you may see trade. Here in Arkansas, every year, $1 billion or $2 billion of trade still takes place along the rivers of Arkansas, and there's a whole waterway designated for that, for commercial purposes on the river. So I would even include going and checking out the commercial stuff, not just the restaurants on the river, but actually hanging out in the commercial areas to be able to see the historic continuity as well. That's how I would be having future generations be able to experience, witness pieces of history and the way we still interact with it today, and how it affects some of the goods that we use because it's shipped to them, and or the economy when you're exporting things.
Yeah, you know, as Indiana Jones once said, if you want to be an archaeologist, you got to get out of the library.
That's right.
Right? And so
exactly.
I think
That makes it
resonates.
tangible and it makes it real.
The great part about like coming here, and I keep coming back to areas like this, and I will always do so, is because you can still see the history here. A lot of times when you head out east, they're so old that they've maybe even lost some of that history. And here you're like, Rush, this was what it was. You can still see it, you know, and there's no other new buildings, there's no Dollar General, there's no Walmarts anywhere close to there, and this is what it was. And so I keep coming back to the middle part of the country because to me it's the most fascinating place. So I'll be going to Missouri and to Arkansas and to Oklahoma and Kansas and all these areas that have more followers from than if I go up to the east. But it's fun to go those places and then come back and get more excited about even finding hidden gems around here.
I think what's beautiful about this and what's beautiful about this moment in history is the extent of the unknown, all of the things that we didn't know at that point. And then the focus on discovery, on science, on new information. And I think that's really important, and I would love students to take that away from it and say, like, don't be afraid of going into situations where you have limited knowledge, unlimited curiosity, and aren't afraid to make mistakes.
You know, I've not cured cancer or invented anything.
Mm-hmm.
I've just told stories.
Yeah.
You think that maybe, you know, you created a storytelling legacy that has enhanced the interest and reading of folks to know more about where places where significant things happen sometimes we've forgotten about.
From explorers and storytellers to the ghosts of forgotten towns, they carry it all, flowing endlessly forward, whispering the past to anyone who will listen. So if you listen close, you can hear the water flowing. And if you listen a little longer, you just might hear the whispers in the holler.